Tish James, the Attorney General of New York and a criminal mastermind, at least according to an indictment filed on October 9th.
I believe this is riddled with mortgage fraud, and frankly, I think that's why she knew so much about the law in terms of how to go after President Trump. She was the fraudster, not President Trump.
Finally, after Trump fired an experienced prosecutor who said there was no case and put his personal lawyer in charge, the grand jury returned a 2-count indictment for mortgage fraud. Attorney General Pam Bondi tweeted that there was one tier of justice for all Americans, but critics say this is payback for James's prosecution of Trump for committing systemic mortgage fraud in his business. And reporting on the case suggests that maybe the story Trump's lawyer presented to the grand jury left out 1 or 2 pretty important details. Crime of the century or crime against ethics? You are the jury. It's impossible to talk about the charges against Tish James without talking about the prosecutor who brought them. Her name is Lindsay Halligan, and she featured prominently in this video we made entitled Political Prosecutions by an Idiot, and we stand by it. Halligan is an insurance lawyer from Florida who never prosecuted a case in her life. She put her name on multiple legal filings in Trump's stolen documents case back in 2022, largely because all the other lawyers who he had working for him at the time were based out of New York and D.C., and none of them was licensed to practice law in the Sunshine State. In federal cases, there has to be at least one lawyer on the case admitted to the local bar, and Halligan had a Florida bar card, so she fit the bill. After the election, Halligan followed Trump to D.C., where she was given the titles Assistant to the President for Domestic Policy and Special Assistant to the President and Senior Associate Staff Secretary. Then Trump gave her another title when he tapped her to de-wokeify the Smithsonian. Meanwhile, Trump was pressuring the Justice Department to go after the long list of Democrats he thinks wronged him, and New York Attorney General Tish James was at the top of that list since she successfully prosecuted him and his business for committing decades of mortgage and financial fraud. Trump has spent years inveighing against James, whom he calls peekaboo, a word that sounds pretty close to a racial slur. Luckily, Trump parked tons of his personal lawyers at the Justice Department, including at the very top. Pam Bondi, who represented Trump in his first impeachment, serves as Attorney General, and Trump's former criminal lawyer Todd Blanche serves as her chief deputy. Trump's also got his pal Bill Pulte serving as director of the Federal Housing Finance Agency. Pulte then appointed himself chair of both Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, which allowed him to go trawling through confidential financial records looking for something to hang on people on Trump's enemies list. The problem is that federal prosecutors are not supposed to bring cases they don't think they can win. That is basic legal ethics, and it's also part of the Justice Department's own policy manual. It says no prosecution should be initiated against any person unless the attorney for the government believes that the admissible evidence is sufficient to obtain and sustain a guilty verdict by an unbiased trier of fact. And so Trump is having a problem finding prosecutors to file these politically motivated indictments because no ethical prosecutor would bring a garbage case where the evidence does not support a conviction. That's why the former U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District of Virginia, Eric Siebert, refused to seek grand jury indictments of former FBI Director James Comey and New York Attorney General Tish James. And that's why he's no longer the U.S. Attorney, because Trump pushed him out and made Bondi appoint Halligan instead. A lawyer who never tried a criminal case in her life is now in charge of hundreds of lawyers in one of the most important prosecutors' offices in the country. Whether that appointment is legally valid is another question, but Halligan did what she was hired to do. She took the indictments that no one else in her office would touch with a 10-foot pole, and she got a grand jury to sign off on them. In short order, she had charged Jim Comey and Letitia James. We live in a very strange moment. You never know who's going to go poking through your data trying to gin up a criminal case against you. And so now is probably a good time to wipe all your personal and private information off the internet. Your cell phone number, your home address, email address, private social media accounts, and tons of sensitive data are shockingly easy to purchase by anybody online. But you can fight back and take control of your private information by signing up for today's sponsor, Incogni. Incogni wipes your personal data from the internet by searching the internet, reaching out to data brokers and websites directly on your behalf, and forcing them to remove your private information. If they resist, Incogni will take care of that too, because Incogni fights back. But what makes Incogni truly powerful in taking back control of your privacy is the custom removals feature. It allows you to flag an unlimited number of sites where your data is exposed, and you can even have Incogni's privacy experts review and tackle the most uncooperative data brokers and people search sites. I've been using Incogni for a while now. In that time, you can see I've been on hundreds of lists, some of which had a high sensitivity score, meaning the broker had tons of data on me. Luckily, Incogni has completed hundreds of takedowns for me. I could never do this myself, so thank you to Incogni for weeks of work and adding me to over 40 suppression lists. And Incogni will continue to conduct ongoing removals because even if the broker removes your data once, they can collect it and publish it again. So if online privacy is important to you, give Incogni a try. If you scan the code on screen or click on the link in the description, you'll get 60% off their annual unlimited plan, or try Incogni risk-free for 30 days. If you decide you want to keep it, you'll still get the 60% discount so long as you use my code LegalEagle, one word. So sign up for Incogni or we will see you in court. Okay, let's talk about the charges against Tish James. They stem from the August 2020 purchase of a modest house in Norfolk, Virginia for $137,000. James borrowed approximately $110,000 from a bank called OVM Financial in a mortgage backed by the Federal National Mortgage Association, aka Fannie Mae. According to the indictment, James signed a second home rider, which required her to use the property as her secondary residence and prohibited its use as a time-sharing or other shared ownership arrangement or agreement that requires her to either rent the property or give any other person control over the occupancy or use of the property. But Halligan alleges that James actually rented the property to a family of 3, netting, quote, thousands of dollars in rents received. She says that James bamboozled the mortgage company into giving her a lower interest rate on the loan, 3% instead of 3.815%, for a total savings of about $19,000 in interest and credits over the life of the loan, which James paid off 4 years later. So James said it was a second home, it was actually a rental, and she lied to the bank. Case closed, right? Well, maybe not. Let's take a closer look, starting with that second home rider. That appears to be Fannie Mae Form 3890, paragraph 6. As Halligan said in the indictment, the rider bars James from entering into any timesharing or other shared ownership arrangement or to any rental pool or agreement that requires borrower either to rent the property or give a management firm or any other person or entity any control over the occupancy or use of the property. So she can't hand it over to a property management company or turn it into a timeshare. Fair enough. That's why the rider says that James agreed to keep the property available primarily as a residence for borrower's personal use. It does not say that James can't rent it out or let someone else stay in the property. In fact, Fannie Mae revised this rider in 2019 to make it clear that buyers were free to rent out their second homes on sites like Airbnb. Okay, back to the indictment. See if you can spot the slippage here. Paragraph 6 says James violated the rider because she wasn't allowed to turn it into a timeshare or enter into an agreement to cede control of the property. And then paragraph 7 says she rented the property out. But you know what's missing? An allegation that she agreed to use it as a timesharing or other shared ownership arrangement or agreement that requires her to either rent the property or give another person control over the occupancy of the property. That's kind of a gaping omission. Halligan never says that James entered into an agreement to rent the property. She says that James rented it out. Those two things are not the same. Okay, one more thing. See where this indictment says James filed Schedule E tax forms under penalties of perjury, treating the property as rental real estate, reporting fair rental days, 0 personal use days, thousands of dollars in rents received, and claiming deductions for expenses relating to the property, further contradicting the second home classification. But it doesn't say what year that happened in, which seems kind of relevant since the second home rider was only binding for 1 year, after which James was free to turn it into a timeshare, a rental property, or literally anything else. And the fact that the indictment yada yadas over those details strongly suggests that the prosecutor left them out because she knows they're not great for her case, which kind of reminds me of something I like to call the shit pile principle. And don't Google this one because I made it up. It goes like this. If there is a giant pile of poop and your footprints are everywhere around it but not in it, that strongly implies that you knew where the pile was and you took evasive action. But okay, let's suppose for the sake of argument that James was prohibited from renting out the Norfolk property and she did it anyway. The bank fraud statute, 18 U.S.C. section 1344, makes it a crime to knowingly execute a scheme or artifice to either defraud a bank or, more broadly, to obtain funds from the bank by means of false or fraudulent pretenses, representations, or promises. And 18 U.S.C. section 1014 makes it a crime to knowingly make any false statement or report for the purpose of influencing in any way a covered mortgage lender. To convict James, Halligan has to prove that James lied on the mortgage application and that she did so knowingly and as part of a corrupt scheme to improperly influence the mortgage lender. Prosecutors would have to show that James knew she was going to rent out the Norfolk property at the time she signed the loan application, but covered up that fact, and that she did so for the purpose of defrauding the bank into offering her a lower rate of interest on the loan. In other words, if this case were to somehow go to trial, prosecutors would have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that James concocted a fraudulent scheme in advance to get an 0.8% reduction on a modest loan, which she voluntarily paid off 11 years early, all so that she could earn a couple $1,000s in rental income. Oops, did I give away the end? Look, as you've probably figured out by now, there's a lot more to this story, and it really does not support the version that Halligan told to the grand jury. Here's how the New York Times reported it. 5 years ago, the door of a modest yellow house on a quiet stretch of avenue in Norfolk, Virginia, swung open to admit a young family looking for a peaceful life after years of turbulence in several cities. The family have lived at the address ever since, according to two people familiar with the home, and until this week, the plan for a more placid existence had largely gone as expected. Several times a year, the people said, a great aunt who had purchased the house in 2020 with her niece in mind would come for an extended stay. Tish James bought the house in Norfolk for her niece, who needed a break and a fresh start. She did not buy it as an investment. She bought it so her family would have a safe place to live. And you remember how the indictment said that James took in, quote, thousands in rent? Well, as a public official, James has to make financial disclosures. The only year for which she claims income related to the property was 2020, where she netted between $1,000 and $5,000. In fact, James's niece already testified to a grand jury and said that she did not pay rent on the property. The Times reports that in June, the niece testified to a grand jury in Norfolk that she had lived in the house for years and that she did not pay rent. The niece was not asked to testify again, and the grand jury that voted to indict Ms. James was not seated in Norfolk, but in Alexandria. So Halligan had testimonial evidence that James was letting her niece stay in the property without paying rent. But she impaneled a second grand jury 200 miles away and didn't let the niece testify. And that's the grand jury that returned the indictment. And by the way, Halligan claimed in that indictment that James really was collecting rent on the property. Am I having a stroke? I feel like I fell asleep and woke up in a hypothetical on the multi-state professional responsibility exam. Okay, so there's a lot going on here, and I am pretty sure all of it is going to wind up in an attorney discipline complaint. But first, I want you to meet someone. The 80s were a special time.
It's a Crazy Eddie blowout blitz, and Crazy Eddie's going nuts with his lowest sale prices ever. See Crazy Eddie now, his blowout blitz sale prices are insane.
Crazy Eddie was an electronics chain in New York in the 80s and 90s. If you've ever seen the Zohan movies with that electronics store called Going Out of Business, you have a pretty good idea of Eddie and his oeuvre. Crazy Eddie was a family business started by Eddie Antar and his parents with his cousin Sam Antar as CFO. It was also spectacularly crooked. They skimmed off much of the profits to avoid paying taxes, which allowed them to undercut their competitors with lower prices, and they paid employees under the table. And then when they went public and wanted to inflate their profits to raise the stock price, they invented a scheme called the Panama Pump to bring back some of the money they'd stolen. The whole thing came crashing down in 1989, and then Eddie fled to Israel under a false name, and Sam testified against his family under a grant of immunity, pled guilty to 3 felonies, and then rebranded himself as a forensic accountant spotting white-collar fraud, because the 90s were also a wild time. But there's a reason we took this trip down memory lane, and that reason is that Sam Antar is the one who went spelunking through Tish James's financial disclosures and real estate records looking for something to pin on her. In March, he published this expose on James's shocking financial disclosure failures at a website run by Roger Stone, the MAGA OG. The post is full of trenchant commentary like, James consistently reported this mortgage in the range of $100,000 to $150,000 for 3 consecutive years, but then in 2023, the reported value inexplicably drops to $75,000 to $100,000 without explanation. The balance on her mortgage went down over time? Amazing! Antar's story was picked up by various right-wing media outlets and appears to be the genesis of the federal criminal investigation.
First of all, I don't give a damn about Trump. I couldn't care less if it's political or not political. That's not my game. My game is forensic accounting. My game is showing proof, and that's what I've done.
Antar made numerous claims about James's finances, and several of them ended up in a criminal referral to the Justice Department sent by Bill Pulte, the guy in charge of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Pulte has been accused of using his access to everyone's confidential mortgage records to gin up cases against Trump's enemies, but he won't say where he's getting his tips.
I'm not going to explain our sources and methods, where we get tips from, who are whistleblowers.
It was thanks to him that this weirdo lawyer named Ed Martin showed up in front of James's house in Brooklyn with a camera crew in tow, cosplaying as a 1960s noir detective. Martin is United States Pardon Attorney, Special Attorney for Mortgage Fraud, Associate Deputy Attorney General, and Director of the Weaponization Working Group. Again, with these guys having 15 job titles. He's also the subject of our video, Trump's Worst Lawyer. We stand by that one too. Anyway, Pulte tried to get Eric Siebert, the former U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District of Virginia, to indict James with respect to another house in Norfolk where a different relative lives. That allegation was nonsense in a totally different way, but for whatever reason, Halligan chose to file charges based on this house, despite testimony from James's niece that she does not pay rent. Does the Justice Department manual have anything to say about that? You bet your bippy it does. It is the policy of the Department of Justice that when a prosecutor conducting a grand jury inquiry is personally aware of substantial evidence that directly negates the guilt of a subject of the investigation, the prosecutor must present or otherwise disclose such evidence to the grand jury before seeking an indictment against such a person. So if you know that the supposed tenant says she's not paying rent, you need to tell the grand jurors that. Did Halligan do that? Well, we do not know, since grand jury proceedings are secret, but I think we're likely to find out, since James will certainly seek to unseal them incident to a motion to dismiss for prosecutorial misconduct. Now, to be fair, the DOJ manual says, while a failure to follow the department's policy should not result in dismissal of an indictment, appellate courts may refer violations of the policy to the Office of Professional Responsibility for review. But the DOJ manual is not binding on Judge Jamar Walker, who can impose whatever remedy he sees fit. James is scheduled to be arraigned on Friday, October 24th, at which time she will plead not guilty. As of this recording, multiple lawyers have entered their appearance on her behalf, including Abby Lowell, the famed criminal defense attorney whose client list includes Hunter Biden, Ivanka Trump, and John Bolton. Her local counsel is Andrew Bossy, the former deputy criminal chief in the Norfolk Division of the Eastern District of Virginia, the office that Halligan now leads. Unlike Halligan, those guys know their way around a federal courtroom, and so far, Halligan is the only lawyer willing to associate herself with this case. Not a single lawyer from EDVA was willing to sign on to the indictment, and so far, none of them will come near it. That's the same problem Halligan had with the James Comey indictment, and she wound up having to import lawyers from North Carolina to represent the DOJ in court. No word yet whether those out-of-state lawyers want to go 2 for 2 and work the James case as well. At the hearing, Judge Walker will set the briefing schedule and pick a trial date, after which things will start happening fast. The Eastern District of Virginia is what's known as a rocket docket, with local rules that impose a compressed briefing schedule that makes it the fastest court in the country. It's part of the culture in EDVA for things to move quickly, and Judge Walker worked for 9 years as a prosecutor there. He knows how this is supposed to go, and he's not likely to have patience for counsel from out of state who need on-the-job training. The Comey case is instructive here because Comey's lawyers announced that they will immediately file motions to dismiss for selective and vindictive prosecution. That is, they'll argue that Comey's prosecution is purely retaliatory for his First Amendment protected speech and that he was treated differently from other people who did the exact same thing. And they'll file a motion to dismiss alleging that Halligan was illegally appointed U.S. attorney and thus anything she put her name on is a legal nullity. We've talked about that before with respect to Alina Habba, another one of Trump's personal lawyers whom he installed as U.S. attorney in New Jersey despite her having zero prosecutorial experience. Notice a pattern here? A court ruled that Habba was unlawfully appointed because she outstayed her 120-day interim term, and a court in Nevada found the same thing with respect to Siegel Chadha, a lawyer installed as U.S. attorney there, past her 120-day assignment. A court has already ruled that Habba was unlawfully appointed because she outstayed her 120-day interim term, and a court in Nevada found the same thing with respect to Siegel Chadha, a lawyer installed as U.S. attorney there past her 120-day term. If Halligan is found to have been illegally installed, indictments with just her name on them are likely to be deemed legally invalid. And remember, no other lawyer would put their name on the indictments of Comey and James. After those initial motions, Comey's lawyers have promised to file several more motions to dismiss based on gross prosecutorial misconduct by Halligan, and you can bet that Tish James's lawyers will follow this exact playbook. In short, there are 100 different ways these prosecutions can and likely will get derailed before trial. And it kind of seems like right-wing media is preparing for that inevitable outcome in the James case. The New York Post has already pivoted from talking about the indictment to making hay out of the niece's criminal history. As for James, she remains defiant.
This is nothing more than a continuation of the president's desperate weaponization of our justice system. He is forcing federal law enforcement agencies to do his bidding, all because I did my job as the New York State Attorney General.
Well, let's see how Trump's insurance lawyer does against some of the best lawyers in the country. Sure would be a shame if she lost her footing and wound up stepping in that pile of...
Now, all this highlights why it's so important to get a great lawyer when you're dealing with your own case. Now, after I started this channel, every week I'd get hundreds of comments and emails from viewers who are dealing with legal problems. And they'd ask, can you help me find a lawyer? How do I know if this attorney is any good? And there's a massive gap in our justice system. It's that people don't know how to find the right lawyer for their specific situation. They're scared, they're overwhelmed, and they end up doing nothing or hiring the first attorney who calls them back. And that really bothered me. So I started to wonder, what if there was a different way? What if we could build a law firm that actually lived up to the values that I talk about on this channel? Transparency, accessibility, and putting clients first instead of chasing billable hours. A firm where you don't need to pay anything up front, and your lawyers only get paid if you do to maximize your opportunity for justice. So a few years ago, I decided to fix that problem. I decided to start my own personal injury law firm. And honestly, it wasn't an easy choice. But I realized I was in this unique position. I had this platform, this community, and the experience. Not to get rich, trust me, there are easier ways to make money than starting a law practice. But we did it because access to justice shouldn't be a luxury. Because finding the right legal representation shouldn't feel like playing Russian roulette with your future. And when you work with my firm, you're not just getting a lawyer. You're getting a team that understands that behind every case is a real person with real stakes. If we can't represent you or you're in a state where we don't practice, we'll take the time to try to match you with an attorney in my personal network of lawyers. A national network of some of the best lawyers in the country who actually specialize in what you're going through, located right where you are, not just whoever happens to be available. So if you're dealing with a personal injury, a car crash, a data breach, sexual harassment, a social security or workers' comp issue, give us a call at the number on screen or click on the link below. Now, I can't represent everyone that watches this channel. I wish I could, but what I can do is make sure that when you need legal help, you have somewhere to turn to that you can trust. So whether it's me handling your case or the incredible attorneys we partnered with, you'll get the same principles of honesty and education that we bring to every video. And if you're dealing with a legal issue and you're not sure where to start, check out the link in the description. Let's have a conversation about how we can help you find not just a lawyer, but the right lawyer for your situation. Because at the end of the day, that's what this is all about, making sure that when life gets complicated, you don't have to face it alone. Which is why when you need a lawyer, you don't just need a legal team, you need the Eagle team.